Welcome to this week's news program. I'm your host and editor, Diana Longree. Thank you for tuning in. To help me with this week's newscast is Mr. Kevin Berglund, a regular reporter on this program. Thank you, Mr. Berglund, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, this is the time of year in many municipalities when the city councils start to consider how they're going to spend their money for capital improvements over the next 5 to 10 years. And some of the money they're going to spend is money that they've been collecting through property taxes or other assessments or fees, or other money that they're going to spend it comes from the bonding that they do and the borrowing that they engage in order to do their capital improvements. Well, Maplewood is no different, and at this most recent Maplewood City Council workshop of June 10th, 2019, there was a presentation by the Finance Department together with the Public Works Department on the capital improvement plan for the next 5 years. Now, this may sound like it's pretty much business as usual, nothing all that interesting or complicated about it, except that when we listen to this presentation in Maplewood, we actually find out some information about the city's finances that up until this point, I don't recall were ever disclosed to the public at all. And so we thought this would be an excellent time to look at the presentation, pull some of the data apart, and to analyze exactly what they're doing with their capital improvement plan and the finances to fund it. So, Mr. Berglund, I know that you've been watching their capital improvement planning for many, many years, and it's sort of an aspirational goal to have that capital improvement plan, correct?
And the capital improvement list, they have a list. It's really, they call it a needs list, but it's more or less a hopes list. Hope they can get this. It's something that they try to look ahead for, and it's not so much of what they, somewhere in there is what they really need, but of course most of it is what they aspire to.
Right, because it's all dependent upon whether or not they can find the funds to do these capital improvements. And capital improvements can be anything from repairs or improvements to the buildings that the city owns, or to the parks, or having to buy a new fire truck, or any of those types of assets that the city has ownership of that they either need to buy or improve.
It's as if they opened one of those wish books and say, wish this, and I wish this, and I wish this. Somewhere, however, in that wish list are things they actually are going to need.
Right.
But of course, they don't separate them on any way that you, as a resident of Maplewood, you would know what was their wishes and what was their real needs.
Right, and a little later on, we'll get to a couple of clips where I think you're going to see that contrast between having the priority of knowing that you need to set money aside to repair the roof, and knowing that a roof is something you need to repair, and then going to the fund and the kitty for the building improvement and repair fund and find out that there's nothing in it. I mean, what was more important, to be saving up money so you could repair a roof of a building you already have, or deciding that we're going to tear down the Wakefield warming house at the ice rink, and put up a $2 to $3 million Wakefield pavilion that most people will never use. So that's a good example, because that was on the capital improvement plan, whereas the repair of the roof was not. Right. From the last go-around. So let's get started with our first clip where it's being introduced. And keep in mind, this is a very important, weighty issue for not just the city of Maplewood, but for any city. So let's take a look.
Item, we have our capital improvement plan. Ms. Paulseth, this is yours.
Good evening, Mayor and Council members.
Good evening.
We're really excited about being here tonight. We know we have a short time to complete this, so we're going to try to get through it as quickly as possible. We're going to depart a little bit from our normal procedure about delivering this presentation. My colleague, Steve Love, is going to be joining us tonight because we've got some new and exciting things to present to you, and he's a big part of it.
Now, at this workshop, the first part of the workshop focused on the North End Working Group report and the report on potential visionary aspirational goals for the Maplewood Mall area and how to redevelop it. And the City Council allotted about 54 minutes for that. That meant that for the hour-and-a-half workshop, that there was only then about 35 minutes left then to focus on the plan for the capital improvement plan. And as you can see, the finance director, she's under a little pressure to try to get all of her information out, knowing that she is now relegated to only having 35 minutes to get all of this out to the council, especially when 2 of the 5 council members are just newly appointed and don't even have any background information on a capital improvement plan. So, Mr. Berglund, are you surprised that they only allotted like 35 minutes for the whole capital improvement plan discussion?
It's as if the city of Maplewood, if everybody's on the time clock and they're all on some sort of wage, and that we've only have $100 to spend on this with all our administrators and all that, and we just got to get this out because it's so exciting, and that's it.
Well, in the fact that they don't focus and provide enough time at a workshop for even the newest council members to have time for questions, to have in-depth analysis or questions of anything, is really shortchanging the council, but also the residents of Maplewood, because the residents of Maplewood, they only have 35 minutes to hear this presentation.
Yeah,
that's
tragic.
Yeah, it truly is. Now, I will say that when the finance director got about halfway through her presentation and realized that she only had about 10 minutes left to go of the allotted time and that weren't going to be able to finish it, I will say that the appointed Mayor Marley Abrams noticed that, well, maybe we should at least try to get to the end of the presentation, if the finance director can speed it up a little bit. So she actually did give her another 15 to 20 minutes added on to finish her presentation. But again, she's under a very high pressure to get it completed in the allotted time.
Well, and again, the 2 new members of the council, neither of them have been involved in any public way with the city before. I mean, they haven't been on a commission that hasn't met behind closed doors. Both those new council members, they were not elected by the public; they were appointed. So I think the staff, the mayor thinks it's just common knowledge. They're really not accountable to the residents. They're accountable to the city manager,
right, and that
the ones who put them on there.
Right, and that they'll just vote
right
along with the rest. Right. Because what else could they do? I mean, how could they challenge anything if they don't have the information? I mean, what would they do? Vote no because I don't have any information? That would be very awkward.
Yeah, I think the presumption is they don't need to know anything, and they're not accountable to the residents, so they don't even need to worry about that aspect. Right. They're going to do what we tell them to do. They're going to be following along.
They're just proxy votes.
Right.
So let's continue with our next clip.
Things to discuss with you tonight, a new funding model for streets discussion, and that's going to be our primary role tonight. We're going to focus on that primarily tonight, but we will cover everything else just a little bit quicker.
So the main focus of this presentation that evening was to talk about the new funding model for their street improvement projects. Now, of course, it's right about the time in her presentation when she's getting to that, when the appointed mayor realized that there certainly wasn't enough time allotted, and then gave Ms. Paulseth another 15 minutes or so to conclude her presentation. But keep in mind that in this capital improvement plan is the main focus, is a change in the way that they finance or do some of their funding for their special assessments to do street improvements. And we'll talk more about that as we get to that point.
And the finance director for the city of Maplewood is the woman there in the jean jacket.
Yes.
And the guy in the tie, he's not the finance director. He's the guy who follows orders. He's the one who complies.
He's
with the
head of
finance
public
director.
works.
Right.
He's a head of
And-
public works.
Yes. So he's under the city manager, and I think you could also say under the finance director. They tell him how we're going to do it, and then he comes up with something, I guess.
And that is a good observation, because as we get into these clips, we're going to be discovering that there were some irregular ways of approaching financing of public works projects in Maplewood throughout the years. And your point is that it was the role of the finance director to hold the public works people accountable when they came with their ideas on how to finance their projects, when they came to the city council on how to finance their projects, that the finance director is the one that should have put the brakes on the methods the public works wanted to use and promoted and talked the councils into supporting. So that's a good observation. And in this case, I think it does seem that the finance director has a better handle on the ramifications of some of those bad practices, because she's had to deal with those bad practices and how to get the city out of some of the financial entanglements that they got themselves into.
But dare say, of course, the finance director is therefore generally damage control too, and covering up, or if you would say, making it non-transparent what's really going on. In other words, dancing around issues instead of being forthright with the residents. I would assume that somebody up there is forthright with the city council in the back room, but don't necessarily count on it, because with those two new council members, I don't think the city staff actually cares if they get right information, because they look at them as just tag-alongs.
Right, yes. Let's see where the discussion goes from here.
A little bit of time on this slide because I want especially the new members to kind of understand why we're placing the emphasis on where we are tonight. And it really all starts with the financing. So there are several different categories of improvements. The first one is vehicles and equipment. For the most part, we're on a pay-as-you-go system. We have a great system. We have a fleet fund set up that replenishes itself based on the amount of depreciation on an annual basis. If there is a vehicle, for instance, our public safety vehicles, particularly our fire vehicles, we haven't got quite as good of a system set up for those, and we are working on that. But there will be a ladder truck in the 5-year CIP plan that's close to $1 million. We won't be able to, pay for that on a pay-as-you-go basis, obviously, because we haven't planned.
Now, she mentioned that for vehicles, for instance, and the replacement of those, that they have a replacement vehicle fund. Well, that is very true. And when I was mayor, we had that same vehicle replacement fund. And there was money that was always set aside to go into the replacement of ambulances and fire trucks. But oftentimes what would be proposed to the council is that when money was needed from somewhere else, because there wasn't enough money to cover something that was immediate, the proposal would always be, well, let's take it out of the vehicle replacement fund, namely the fire truck fund, and then the money would be taken out of there. And so here, as you've heard, they need a new ladder truck, which will be $1 million, and they don't have the money in the fund. Probably because somewhere along the way, they rob the fund of that money for something else.
And of course, that's a huge insight. You have public safety. Public safety is mostly personnel and vehicles, fire trucks, police trucks. That is intended to be their number one priority, public safety. And of course, this is the area where they're lacking. They're lacking where we really don't have that fund properly managed. And of course, the problem is they are putting money away from it. And up at City Hall, the powers that be, the chain of command, including the city manager and others, looks, as you mentioned, at the public safety fund, not as a sacrosanct priority fund, but as a slush fund. Whenever we have some sort of scheme, some sort of thing, maybe we want to buy a golf cart, we can go to our public safety fund. Because there was a time that the public safety department under Jim Antman was going to put volunteer citizens patrol in an open-air golf cart to chase hoodlums around in the park.
So that's just one example of where they had to come up with some money from a slush fund. So let's continue with our next clip.
We have a building fund. It really doesn't have any money in it, but we'll talk a little bit about that more later. We have identified, a way to improve the fund balance in that fund. As our debt service payments are falling off, we're able to capture that capacity and levy money, and this will be presented for the 2020 budget process. We'll be able to levy money for those building funds, so that we will be able to do projects like roof replacements, any other kind of maintenance, other than building a brand-new building. We should be able to handle all the maintenance projects. You think of any new ones that...
So you could have anything from roof replacements, you could have floor finishings, you could have HVAC system, our heating and cooling system, so it could be a lot of those.
So all these items that you heard being listed out that are required for maintaining your buildings, roof replacement, HVAC system, that's the heating and the air conditioning, whatever other kinds of problems might come up with your buildings and your maintenance of your buildings. Okay, they identify that they have these assets, they have an asset plan, they have a building maintenance fund, but as you heard her say, it's empty. There's nothing in it. And yet a little later on, we'll hear how appointed Marley Abrams, the mayor, thinks it's such a wonderful thing that they got their asset management plan. Well, what is the point of having an asset management plan if you don't have any money to fund it? Now, of course, I am very glad that Ms. Paulseth put this out there that the fund is empty, so at least the public knows that the fund is empty. But here's another thing. Did you catch this, Mr. Berglund, where she said that they've got some ideas about how to put money in that fund, and she's indicated that one of those ideas is that they're going to be able to levy for that money. That means asking the taxpayers to pay more money over and above their regular property taxes that go in the operational fund. Because when they say levy like that, that means it's something separate and different.
Wow, it seems like it's odd where in the city of Maplewood, whenever somebody has it's like the light bulb goes on, the only solution they have is, guess what, levy, mean increased taxes. And of course, they will tell you we're going to have this building fund because buildings are one of their primary assets up there. And you know what? We're going to levy and we're going to put money in the building fund. But what happens years later when they have money in the building fund and they have another scheme or thing they need money for? Guess what they probably do? They go and they rob that fund for their new what they would consider initiative. But it's just they look at it as another slush fund. So you can see, I think the only reason she let that out of the bag is because up there at City Hall, they've already got a whole construct of a big new tax increase they're going to present. And at this time, they're going to present is, we've been in control up here for whatever years. And, we like you said, we have an asset management fund. But how can you have an asset management fund when you don't have any money to take care of boiler systems, roofs, things that are the bread and butter of what the city has to do.
Right, and some of our viewers might say, yeah, but you know what, if they levied and they put money in there, I mean, really in good faith, they're not going to go and they're going to rob that fund for some other purpose, except that no. What they're going to do is that they're going to label it an intra-department loan, because we just saw that happen this past year. There was money in the utility fund, and those funds generally are used in the road reconstruction projects for the utilities and the costs of the road reconstruction project and getting it reworked when they do those projects. Well, there was money in that fund because they collect these utility fees from everybody every quarter, and they put them into that slush fund. Then Maplewood decided that they had to buy property at 20% above the market value and outbid a private entity for a property in the Gladstone area, but Maplewood had no money to fund their purchase of this property, this speculation, this land speculation. So what did they do? They entered into an intra-department loan where the redevelopment department went and they borrowed $2 million from the utility fund with no terms as to when it had to be paid back. So now the utility fund is minus $2 million. And now we'll have road reconstruction projects. We'll have to go find $2 million somewhere else. So you see, that's exactly what we're talking about. Levy to fill one account that then is used by some other department with their interdepartmental loan for some other purpose. And then, of course, they'll pay it back someday with interest. But of course, whoever holds anybody accountable between the departments. Certainly the city manager is not firing people for not getting these interdepartmental loans paid off.
And I think they're really dancing around with that term loan, because most people understand when you get a loan, instead of an outright grant or free money, that loans need to be paid back, and they have to be the top priority to pay back. When debt has to be due, everything else...
There should be a payment schedule.
Yeah, everything
and
else
I would be willing to bet that there is no payment schedule between the redevelopment department of Maplewood and the utility fund of Maplewood, that they have this inter-department loan, but that there's no repayment schedule that says every month that they have to pay interest only, or that they have to pay principal and interest. I don't think there is such a thing between them.
And for all practical purposes, they don't, even though they use that word loan, they really don't mean loan. And it's highly questionable whether these so-called loans ever get paid back. And if whether they get paid back, it's just we have another tax increase, and we're going to have the loan paid back, not from another department, but going back to, as they sell the well again, increases everybody's taxes when they need money for a new fire truck, or they need to put a new boiler system in, or they need a new roof. The money that has accumulated has all been robbed by other departments, although they called it a loan.
Right. Well, and see, the thing is that generally speaking, with loans, you have to have some kind of collateral. You have to have some kind of backing of whatever. But you see, in a city, when they do intra-department loans, what it really ends up with is that you're at the accounting department computer, and they open up their spreadsheet, and they move some monies from one part of the ledger here to another part of the ledger over here. Now that's the loan. We've just moved it from here to there.
Yeah, it's just a transfer. Loan means actually a transfer to a different account. And of course, this is not necessarily a term of art, I don't think. This is where you're counting on the good faith of the city officials, including, most importantly, the administrators in the city to be true to their word. And of course, in the dark city of Maplewood, expect no trust to the residents. We do what we can get away with, and we can almost get away with anything when we've put the three of the 5 members of the council in their positions themselves.
By appointment, that's right. So in this presentation, they estimate that about $200,000 a year is what they will be able, with their new levy idea, to fund this building fund. Let's find out if that's sufficient.
Forward, we feel that we are going to have enough funds at $200,000 a year funding level to handle all of those improvements that we formally borrowed for. Anything larger than that, brand new building would require debt.
So she believes that with this money, this $200,000 a year that they're going to levy for, that they're going to put into the building improvement fund, that will be enough to cover their needs annually. $200,000. Now you heard what else though she said, that previously for any kind of repairs and those types of items, they bonded for those items. They bonded for them. So they actually borrowed money to do their routine repair and maintenance of items that are, like you mentioned, boilers, HVAC system, roof repairs. They had to replace the filters at the pool, all of these things. Even though they knew they were all things that had to be done, and they had a building fund, the building fund was empty, and so what else could they do but take out a loan from the and bond for it and get the money that way? Well, that's expensive to the taxpayers.
And of course, if we're to date back, what all these professional administrators are to do, they're supposed to be planners. In the city of Maplewood, they claim they have an asset management fund. Management means planning. And all of a sudden they see, wow, our roof, surprise, emergency, we need money. Well, what, I mean, aren't you all professional planners? That should not be, there should be no surprises,
right.
No shocks, no surprises when it comes to boilers, parking lots, roofs, that's all, that all deteriorates. It's not like the whole thing collapses at one time.
Exactly.
It all goes slowly.
Exactly. Well, let's continue.
And last but not least, redevelopment. We will be issuing some tax increment financing bonds. We have left some room for redevelopment. It's still very loose. We don't really know what's happening yet in the Gladstone neighborhood or any of the other development areas. But we have left some room to be able to issue some tax increment financing debt for those redevelopment opportunities that we know that you're going to want to move forward with.
And that, of course, that is tied into that whole redevelopment there that they're hoping that they're going to be successful in the Gladstone neighborhood, where they bought that piece of speculative real estate where they had to rob $2 million from the utility fund in order to fund the purchase, the reclamation of the property, the demolition of the property, the other improvements that they need to do to the property before anybody can ever build something there. When, keep in mind, another private entity had wanted to buy that parcel also, and the city went out of their way to outbid them so the city and the taxpayers could be on the hook for the property. Go ahead.
I dare say, this finance director, that's what her job is, to be a numbers cruncher. And yet with her presentation, instead of telling us the knowledge, giving us the numbers, she uses words like, I feel. I feel, well, I'll tell you, you can go to any resident in Maplewood and they all have feelings too. We want it, you're a professional, you're paid as a professional. Why are you using words like I feel? I feel, it's my opinion, I feel. And instead of talking like a professional who has a grasp of the numbers, she says kind of loosely, we're leaving room. It's loosely. I thought finance and accounting was these are the facts. This isn't an opinion. But it's clear that I think that this finance director, is, at least the way she's presenting herself, is she, I guess, is kind of not so interested in giving us the numbers, giving us the facts, but having feelings of the way stuff should be going on, or maybe she's giving us the feelings of the city manager. Because we know Melinda Coleman has a lot of feelings, and she does, in my mind, after watching her for quite a while, she really does not have her grasp of the facts of what's going on in the city of Maplewood.
And certainly, if the numbers were there, they might be shocking to the viewers and the residents of Maplewood, and they would be upset.
And of course, we do know the numbers have to be there because there are numbers. There's money that is coming out of taxpayers all the time. There are numbers there, and apparently they're winning awards for their wonderful ability to grasp the numbers. It's just that in the dark city of Maplewood, the numbers are not going to be transferred over to, or not going to be talked about to the public.
Right.
It's more of we have feelings.
Perhaps their awards are based on accounting based on feelings. That could be it. Well, let's continue.
The purpose of having a capital improvement plan, we have a planning document for 5 years, but we plan out for 10 years, and even in some cases 15. That helps us to know where we're at in that 5-year period. It really gives us a roadmap to tell us what we're doing today and in this 5 years, what it's going to look like in 10 and 15 years. And it really helps to keep us on a sustainable level. It's also a legal requirement in order to issue debt to finance capital improvement projects. So this is all going to be part of that legal requirement.
I want to mention first that you heard that technical fuzziness there in that clip. Well, that is a technical issue with the transmission of the presentation to the public. So that is the quality of the audio if you were to listen to it either on your own cable cast, if you lived in Maplewood and you had cable, or if you're watching it on their web streaming. So here's Maplewood. They've got $500,000 a year coming in from the PEG fees that are paid by the Comcast Maplewood subscribers. They've bought all kinds of new equipment. They've started their new communications department, and they have 3 people at least on staff in this communications department that's responsible for all of this broadcasting and cable casting of this programming and putting things together. And yet this is the quality that they have coming out of their production. So first of all, I just wanted to let you know that that is on their end. But she indicated that in order to bond for any of these projects, that it's a state law that a CIP, a capital improvement plan, be adopted. So that's really why the city is going through this dog and pony show, is that they need to give a presentation to the council so that eventually they can get the council to vote yes, so that in the end, the administrators up at City Hall can then do their projects, propose their bonding, and just have the council rubber stamp the bonding and the projects.
And day in, day out, it's the same pitch from the city top brass, city administrators. Plan. You know, we are professional planners. We're required to be to plan by law, but we don't even plan 5 years in advance. We don't even plan 10 years. We plan 15. All we do is plan, except we haven't planned the way to deal with the leak, which we know has started in the roof of one of our city hall building. Now, what kind of planning is really going on up at City Hall?
That's right. Well, let's see what happens from here.
Just interrupt you for just one moment. And this is really for the benefit for our new council members. The 3 more senior council members are very familiar with our asset management plan, which was new when I started on the council. I think now, well, it's not so new now. Maybe it's 5 years old or 4 years old, something like that. Prior to that time, do you want to maybe explain it? You can, Mr. Love, you're very familiar with it. Because when I was reviewing the documents this weekend, the council packet, I was thinking about that asset management plan, and I think that that's important for everyone on the council to realize that the recommendations for the fire truck or the different park improvements come down to our asset management plan, because I think that's really one of the fundamental documents that really drives this. So can you just do just a short little?
So now she's putting this is the appointed Marley Abrams, the mayor. And she is putting the ball back in the court of Steve Love, because here's the story behind this. She is being very careful not to be inaccurate and tell a false story that she has told many times before. But you see, now that she is the appointed mayor, and maybe she's considering that she is going to run for election in 2 years so she can be an elected mayor, she wants to be very careful that she doesn't repeat the same false story that she's told in the past. And this is the false story. She started off by saying that when she first was on the council, they first got an asset management plan. Well, now she knows that's false. The reason she knows that's false is because I provided her the documentation to show her that her statements were false, that when I was mayor back in 2006 and 7, that we put together an asset management plan on a spreadsheet that was actually conducted by an employee called Larry Farr. And it was his idea, together with then city manager Greg Copeland, to put this together, because what they discovered is that the city of Maplewood had no asset management plan for their buildings or for their various different equipment and when they had to be replaced, especially with the buildings. And so Larry Farr put together a big spreadsheet and itemized exactly all the different items in each of the buildings and when they would be anticipating that there'd have to be maintenance or repairs of each of those things. And while it wasn't a sophisticated software program, it was indeed on a spreadsheet, and he presented it to the council, and we have the film footage of him doing so. Now, of course, a few years later, that was translated into some other kind of software, and Larry Farr hired a company to come in and to build upon the work that he did. Well, then the city public works manager, Chuck All, he wanted to hire his buddies to do that work instead. So he hired somebody else. So then the city refused to pay the people that Larry Farr hired. And the people that Chuck All hired, they went and they took the work of the contractor that Larry Farr hired, and they called it their own work. And then they presented a beautiful spreadsheet, a plan, a booklet, and all kinds of bells and whistles, and said, this is the asset management plan you've been looking for. And yet, it was all built off of the work of Larry Farr. And the reason why it came to the attention of Larry Farr and Greg Copeland back in 2006 and 7 is because when I was taking office as mayor, we had water leaks at City Hall where there were pails underneath the leaks in the ceiling collecting the water. We had water streaming through the walls into the gymnasium of the community center. And everybody was throwing their hands up in the air wondering, oh my God, what do we do? And that's when that asset management plan was born, when we had a new city manager and a new facilities manager putting their heads together and saying, we have to take control of this. So you can see Marley Abrams, while she still wants to get credit for this big glorious plan that Chuck All and his buddy put together that she wants to claim that was her big idea, she knows it wasn't her big idea, and now she has to be careful between implying it was her idea and saying it was her idea and being false.
Okay, the asset management plan was there years before she arrived, and apparently this was her key. This is something that she really keyed in as the most fundamental thing of the city. Isn't that how she presented it there?
Yep.
But she doesn't really have the ability to explain it, and she's tossing it over to some other soldier to come up and spew out their more misinformation about what's going on, so that they're a good soldier to the mayor, because that's what she's looking for, good soldiers. What more? We can spew out some disinformation, and then I won't have to be held accountable. But despite all that, she looks at this as the key document, and the document was there all set up when she arrived, and yet she wants to take credit for being there for 5 years and working on this, and you can clearly see you can have all this on the spreadsheet, but you have to manage it, meaning you got a plan and you have to fund it. And there's been no funding. She hasn't followed through on this document that she was given, and now she wants to say that something is being successful. Well, why? If something has been such a success and you focused on this like a laser beam, which of course is more misinformation, false information, inaccurate information on her part, why are you going to have to increase taxes to fund something that was your top priority?
Right, because we have heard from the finance director that that building fund is empty. Well, let's continue on and find out what happens next.
Asset management program called Cartograph. It's a software that we use for this. And we essentially have all our assets in it. As you mentioned, it could be anywhere from land to parking lots to utilities to equipment to our facilities. And what this does is allows us to know exactly what we have, the condition it's in. So as we start looking at what improvements need to be done or what should be included in the plan, we can prioritize things both based off of funding and as well as the current conditions.
Thank you. That way, council members, we can plan if we're going to need a new roof somewhere, or if we're going to need a new fire truck. We know that it's coming. It's not any big surprise.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that.
Well, now that was a whole big nothing clip. They all just repeated everything that was said in the previous part of the presentation, just in a different way. It's like they think the two new council members who were appointed are stupid or something, that they didn't get it the first, second, or third time, that they got to tell them again, oh, well, the reason we have this is so we can plan, in case if we got to replace a roof. Yeah, you understand now yet? You got it? You got it? Or maybe we need, Mr. Berglund, maybe we need to say it another way, a different way. No, come on.
Well, and it shows you a little bit of the dark side of the moon up there when this is her big initiative. After we've just heard there's no money in the building fund, there's no money for a fire truck up there, and you know what? All these are going to be a big surprise. She says, we don't want any surprises, and this is my top priority, not to have surprises, and this is what I've been working on, and yet everything is going to be a big surprise, even though we know it's all there, and we haven't used our cartographic software, and who knows how much that cost and how much that costs to manage. We haven't used it to do any of our planning with.
But we've got progress, though. We've got progress. We've moved from an Excel spreadsheet to some high-price, non-user-friendly software.
And that is always the issue that comes up with software, is because whenever you have sophisticated, complicated software, it requires tremendous amount of investments to train people. And the question is, who's trained on this? With something on a sheet of paper, or even on a back of a napkin, or people can read it and understand it. They can access it. I don't know. It doesn't seem like even this appointed mayor has the ability, even though, again, this is top priority, to access it personally to know what's going on. Mm-hmm. So I guess she's going to need some software training too.
Yeah, last week we reported on her needing the intranet training, so I guess now she'll have to go to software training. Let's continue.
This slide, what I really wanted you to take away is that the total 5-year CIP is just about $70 million. Again, street improvements are 47 million of that, so almost 68%. You'll note that building improvements are 11%. That's typically not the case, but what we have included is roughly a $7 million fire station, new fire station or rehabbed fire station, whatever it might end up being. So that is included in the 2020 CIP. We know that hasn't been acted on yet, but it's there because we know it's in the works and it can be moved around. You'll always have the final say on it, but it is in the plan. It is in our debt projections that we're going to be showing you in a little bit. But again, the main takeaway there is that the streets are the biggest part of this plan. The park improvements, we're trying to stay true to the $1 million a year recommendation from the master plan study. We're at 5.2 million in expenditures for parks. So we hope that we're meeting the needs for the community.
So this gives you an idea of how that pie for capital improvements, how it's split up between the different categories. Let's continue.
Roughly is going to come from debt, from new debt, GO bonds. And what's different about this is each year that we've shown you this now in the last 3 years, the amount that's coming from debt in the total 5-year CIP is less and less. And you'll see more coming from governmental funds, primarily because that's where the franchise fees are coming from another governmental fund. And the enterprise funds really are utility contributions. We no longer are, and that's a change too, we no longer are issuing debt on the utility component of the project. We've analyzed our utility funds. We've asked you for a couple of small rate increases, and you've granted them, and we've got this planned out for the next 10 years. All of these projects that you're going to see in here, the utility component will be paid for with cash from the utility funds, no debt on the.
In that clip, she talks about a process that the city of Maplewood used for years and years and years. And they used it when I was mayor as well. It was actually something that I questioned because when they have their utility fees or their environmental utility tax or the sanitary sewer fees, those are separate independent streams of income separate from property taxes. And they can actually bond against those income streams. And that's what Maplewood was doing on a regular basis. And they would bond against those income streams in the future. So for instance, it was very typical that the then Public Works Director, Chuck All, would say, well, we want to bond against the environmental utility fund and blah, blah, blah about how they wanted to use these funds for whatever. And so then I would ask, well, how much is in that environmental utility fund? And he would never know. And the reason he never knew is because those funds were always spoken for in the future. So that whatever was being collected wasn't really money that the city could use. It was money that the city always had to pay back because it had already been spoken for and the money was already spent.
In other words, what they're paying with those funds, those fees that are on your water bill, your electric bill, they were fees that were not going to any kind of project, they were going to pay debt. And they've assembled quite a bit of debt.
Right. And you see, and that debt is not actually included in the other debt that they take out the bonds for doing the road reconstruction projects themselves. So they have those bonds, those GO bonds, And then they would have the debt associated with bonding against the environmental utility tax, the sanitary sewer tax, whatever other fees they wanted to bond against. And so they had that. And then they also have debt that's associated with tax abatement bonds, which is also not included when they talk about their big debt number. And so we have reported how the city of Maplewood, in an effort to get their debt down so that they look better when they're getting their rating from Moody's, they get their debt down, they've shifted their vehicle for borrowing over to this tax abatement bonds, to equipment bonds, to these other types of debt vehicles, because it doesn't count against that other major debt.
Right, and so it's very hard in the dark of night, which the residents are placed, to know exactly how much debt is up there at City Hall. But there's a debt hanging all over, and hopefully somebody is actually managing it. Somebody is actually putting that down on a spreadsheet at least. But from all indication, nobody up at City Hall is talking about where all this debt is.
And really what they need to do is that they need to line item every single way that they have incurred debt, whether or not it is through geo bonds, equipment bonds, tax abatement, other kinds of borrowing mechanisms, and put that all together in one place and then add up the line items to find out what that total is. But when they talk about debt, they're only talking about specifically that debt which is looked at by the rating companies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's. They're not talking about all the other debt. So let's continue with the next clip.
Bonding is used for, you have your full street reconstruction projects, so you'll have bonding for part of the project costs, but also bonding for assessments. And in our street reclamation projects, you have franchise fee instead of geo bonding for project costs, but you still have debt for assessments on that.
So what he's talking about is that the city has their bonding that they have to do, and of course there's people who are along the road reconstruction route that have their special assessments. Some of those folks have cash in their pocket, so they'll pay their special assessment to the city, so then the city has that covered for that particular parcel. But for that individual that doesn't have that money to pay for their special assessment, well then they have to pay the city in installments over 15 years. Well, in order to still pay the bills though, the city needs to bond for that so they can pay the bill. The city gets charged a certain interest rate. The property owner pays to the city their special assessment plus interest at an interest rate that's greater than what the city's being charged for the use of that same money. So oftentimes it's a 2% difference, and the city collects that extra 2% interest, and you would think that, oh, well then they're going to use that for something. Well, it turns out they use that because they've got so much debt, they had to use it for paying off debt. So they're making interest off of the property owners to pay off more debt that the city's incurred.
And this is set aside that asset management plan. I don't think they managed to put their roads in there, because we know their roads in Maplewood, they have all kinds of potholes and they're not being maintained. And we know when they do a road reconstruction project, the amount that they're actually assessing the property owners, that would be the homes, is only 20% of what the real cost is approximately 20%.
Right, well, and of course
so
there's-
that's all going to be debt. The 80% is all additional debt to all the property tax residents of Maplewood.
Exactly, exactly. And that's why they can't be robbing their utility funds of $2 million when that really, by rights, has to go to the road reconstruction projects. And that's where it's supposed to go to start with. Well, we've got time for one more clip before the end of our program, so let's take a look.
When I first came here, I think we met with you all individually, and we talked about why the debt was as high as it was and what we could maybe do about it. And it seemed pretty daunting at the time. Michael Thompson was here as the Public Works Director at the time. He was very helpful in telling me about the history of the projects and just going through them and understanding what happened. But he didn't stay too long. And then Steve took over, and it took a little while for him to really get on board with all the things that he had. It took a while to get his position replaced. But we got together as soon as we could.
So let's pull that slide back up, because you see, this is a very important slide that discloses other areas of debt that really hasn't been talked about in front of the council in the past. Okay, we know that there's the $80 million in outstanding debt. That's the long-term debt, basically involved with the road reconstruction projects over the past 20 years.
And M stands for million.
M stands for million, so that's 80 million. Now, there's an 8 million overall deficit in improvement project funds, a deficit. Now, in our next program, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Let's bring this back up again. $2.4 million deficit in municipal state aid account. That means that they have a minus, a negative in their municipal state aid account, so that anytime they receive municipal state aid, Maplewood doesn't actually get it to use it. What it means is that it goes to pay the debt that Maplewood has to the state. Let's pull up our list again. $8 million pending state payments. Well, because there is $8 million of municipal state aid debt that the Maplewood owes the state of Minnesota, when they have municipal state aid monies that are due to Maplewood for roads in Maplewood that are state aid roads that are entitled to state funding, the state of Minnesota hasn't been giving that money to Maplewood. It's on hold, it's frozen, because Maplewood is behind in its payments to the state of Minnesota. Now, this is a debt that we have not heard about here in the past. This is just coming to light now that they've actually gotten around the corner to start their payments back up. But when they weren't able to make their payments, they never told the residents of Maplewood that maybe part of the reason that the potholes are as big as buckets is because they can't get their money from the state of Minnesota because they owe money to the state of Minnesota. Well, we'll have more on this next week. It'll be a fascinating discussion. Mr. Berglund, thank you for being here.
They've really dug some big financial potholes in Maplewood. Thanks for having me.
And viewers, I hope that you found this informative. We'll be back again next week. See you then. Bye-bye.